All right, good evening, lady and gentlemen, only one lady today. Welcome to this morbidity and mortality meeting on a decidedly an interesting and a rare case. Pavan, our second year student, will take us through this. The two consulting doctors were Dr. Ravi Shankar, who managed it surgically, and Dr. Santosh and Vijay Kumar, our physician gastroenterologists at Sagar. One of them hopefully will join us soon, but we can start. Pavan, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Pavan Kumar, second year DNB resident from Sagar Hospitals. Welcome to this month's mortality and morbidity session. Sir, 1 minute, sir. So, a 60 years gentleman came to emergency on 4th November with complaints of generalized weakness with 3 episodes of melena since a day. There was no history of hematemesis, nausea and vomiting, fever with chills and rigors, syncope or loss of consciousness. Patient has a chronic duodenal ulcer with gastric outlet obstruction, so he underwent upper GI endoscopy with balloon dilatation on 20th January. As symptoms were not.
Pavan, your slides are not moving.
Sir, no, sir.
Click on it again. Click on that again. Click on your screen again, and then now it's moving. Yeah, once. Yeah, correct. It's moving now. Yeah, go on.
Yes.
You have to go back one slide, I think.
Sir, once again, can I start from the clinical scenario, sir?
No, go back. Go back and make it full screen.
I made it full screen, sir.
It is not full screen on our screens. You probably haven't understood what full screen is.
Sir,
okay, press F5. Just press F5. Function key, you know, F5.
Yes, sir.
Nothing is happening, Pawan.
Sir, no, sir.
Nothing is happening.
Nothing is happening.
Actually, in my laptop, it is in full screen, sir.
All right. Maybe you will have to log out and log in again if it is not.
No, sir. Actually, sir, this problem solves with he stop the screen sharing screen again. It will be.
Sorry. Yeah. Screen share stopping and you start sharing screen again.
Okay, sir.
Stop sharing and then start sharing again.
Okay, sir.
Yeah. Make it full screen.
No, sir.
No, it's not full screen. All right, we'll accept this. We don't need full screen. So please start off. Yeah, go to slide number 2.
Yes, sir. This is. Can I start?
Yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead. This is not
16.
slide 2, it is like slide 3. Can you go back one slide?
Sir, this is 1 and 2, sir. This is.
No.
There is a problem, I think.
There is a problem. Now, hold on. Hold on. All right. Now, stop sharing.
Yes.
You guys can see everything?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Can you see the screen? Full screen?
Yes, sir.
Pawan, I'll send you a bill later, okay? All right, go on.
So can I start, sir?
Yeah.
Please.
A 60 years gentleman came to the emergency on 4th November with complaints of generalized weakness with 3 episodes of melena since a day. There was no history of hematemesis, nausea and vomiting, fever with chills and rigors, syncope or loss of consciousness. Patient has chronic duodenal ulcer with gastric outlet obstruction, so he underwent upper GI endoscopy with balloon dilatation on 20th January 2020. As symptoms were not relieved, he underwent exploratory laparotomy, truncal vagotomy, gastrojejunostomy with jejunojejunectomy on 14th March 2020. He is a known case of ischemic heart disease with anterior wall MI recently on 1st October with severe left ventricular dysfunction with left ventricular apical clot. He is also a known case of COPD. As patient is a known case of COPD, he is on MDI with levosalbutamol, ipratropium bromide, formoterol, and budesonide, and he is a known case of ischemic heart disease patient. So he is on tablet aspirin with clopidogrel once daily, tablet rosuvastatin once daily, tablet metoprolol succinate with ramipril once daily, tablet spironolactone with toracimide twice daily, and tablet rivaroxaban once daily.
I'm unmuting myself. I didn't, click the slide. Why is he on rivaroxaban?
Sir, recent anterior wall MI is there, sir.
Okay.
Sir, it is an anticoagulant. It is a factor 10 in
Fair
it,
enough.
sir.
How did they treat the MI?
Sir, actually, conservatively they managed it, sir, initially.
So no stent.
No stent, sir.
Yeah. Still, they felt there should be an anticoagulant. All right.
Yes.
Go ahead. Yeah.
On examination, patient was moderately built and nourished, and he was conscious and oriented with GCS 15/15 with pallor. Vitals were as shown with BP 90/60. So we started noradrenaline at a rate of 5 ml per hour. On systemic examination, we noticed normal bilateral vesicular breath sounds. S1, S2 were heard. Her abdomen was soft with no distension, with midline laparotomy scar and normal bowel sounds.
Yeah. With full screen, I'm unable to monitor the chat box. So Ravi, if you could kindly check the chat box and
yes, sir. Yes,
point
sir.
out if there are any comments or questions.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Blood investigations were done except for HB, which showed 5.6 and elevated PT-INR and APTT values. Other were normal. In view of elevated PT-INR and APTT values and low HB value, we transfused 2-pin PRBC and 2 FFP on 5th November. On next day of blood transfusion, patient underwent upper GI endoscopy, which showed post-GJ status with deformed bulb and erosive duodenitis. Again, 2-pin PRBC was transfused post upper GI endoscopy to stabilize the HB.
From 5.6 Pavan, would you expect 4 units of PRBC? Take it up to 13.1.
No, sir.
How much would you expect
Sir,
normally?
for every pint, there will be 1 gram of HB will be rise in HB is there, sir.
Correct. And how do you explain this then? Go on. It's
Yes, sir.
obvious, common sense. You can say that either of the 2 readings may be incorrect.
Yes, sir.
You understand?
Yes, sir.
It may not be 5 to start with, or it may not be 13. And if from 5 to, you would expect it to come to 9 or 10. If the reading is indeed correct of 13, is there another explanation for it?
Sir,
Hari?
Sir, sorry, sir. Can you repeat it? So
As I said,
Yes, sir.
you would expect with 4 units the hemoglobin with no further bleeding.
Yes, sir.
With 4 units, you would expect it to go from 5.6, which is 6, to about 10.
Yes, sir.
And we said that because it is 13, either the readings are wrong, but my extension of the question is, Suppose the readings are correct. Is there another logical explanation for this? For the hemoglobin to be 13 rather than 10?
Sir, clumping of cells, no, sir.
Yeah. Madam,
Maybe.
I did. Are you seeing a gray rectangle in your screens?
No, sir.
No, good, fine. So I can monitor the chat box also then. Yeah. Madam has made a point there, Naz, that there could be third space loss. That's right, dehydration.
Dehydration or hemodilution in the first place.
The
When
first place.
first
When the
was
first
done.
first
Yeah.
thing was done, there could be hemodilution or dehydration when the second one was done.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
that is what would happen. And also, what is the normally accepted error in the measurement of hemoglobin by the conventional methods in our lab, present day labs? This is an important thing I want all the residents to have in mind. It is 10%. Okay,
Okay.
either way. So if you have a hemoglobin of 10, reading of 10, it is to be taken as somewhere between 9 and 11.
Yeah.
You understand?
Yes.
That was the point.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sir, this is funny because the British police,
Yeah.
they also have a 10% error. So if you are over speeding, they will give you 10% and they will
10% margin.
10%.
Yeah.
So if it is 70, so 78 and 85. If you are above 85, then you will definitely be caught.
Got
So,
yeah. Okay, go ahead, Pawan.
Sir. So next.
I have to go. Sorry, I forgot that I was doing the thing. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go on.
On the second day after upper GI endoscopy, patient complaining of abdomen pain over the epigastrium. On examination, we noticed perabdomen was soft and tenderness over the epigastrium with guarding. We made a clinical diagnosis of perforation. The image in the slide shows X-ray erect abdomen, which showed air under the free air under the right dome of the diaphragm, suggestive of hollow viscous perforation.
Santosh, I see that you have logged in. Welcome. Can you have your video on, please? And give us your comments on the first endoscopy that you did, that your team did. Unmute yourself, please. Yeah. If you can have the video on as well, please.
good evening, Santosh.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah.
Can we go back to the endoscopy slide, sir?
Yeah. Yeah, there it is.
So this patient came apparently, I was not there, but Dr. Vijay Kumar was there.
Sure.
So patient came for history of GI bleed, and after all the initial resuscitation and PPI infusion, endoscopy was planned, and as we see in the report, there was a deformed bulb, and from whatever extent the scope could be passed, there was some erosive duodenitis, and also the previous GJ was noted. Not much active bleeding was noted. That we can't explain how, and whether the PPI infusion itself settled the whatever GA bleed.
Yeah. Generally, if somebody is bled down to 5.6 grams, unless his starting point was 6 or 6.5,
Yes,
okay,
sir.
I presume his starting point would be about 10 or something like that. With these findings, would you expect such a drop in hemoglobin?
I mean, at least in the images, we don't see any.
Yeah, very
altered
unlikely.
blood.
You would
Very
see,
unlikely. Yeah.
you would see an ulcer or a lesion, a polyp or something that would actually bled. Pavan, what are the stigmata of rebleed in an ulcer if you see one on endoscopy? There isn't an ulcer in this case, but I'm asking generally you should have an idea of what are the criteria, endoscopic criteria, to tell you that A, the patient has had a big bleed, and B, is likely to bleed again.
Sir, is there any visible blood vessels, sir?
Correct?
And is there is any clotted blood,
Yeah, fresh clot.
fresh clots?
Yeah, actual bleeding. You can see a spurter
Spurter.
bleeding.
Yes, sir.
All right.
Yes, sir.
These are the main ones.
Cherry red spot.
Cherry red spot. What does it denote? Yeah, it is an area from which the patient would have bled. It is a spot on the blood vessel where the patient would have bled and it has clotted over. The reason it's likely to rebleed again is that this clot is unstable. And if the pressure of the vessel increases even a little bit, that clot can get dislodged and they can bleed again. Santosh, you have anything else to add?
Sorry, sir, I missed some comments in between.
We're talking about the stigmata of rebleeding.
Yeah.
You mentioned about cherry red spot, actual
Yeah.
spurter,
Oozing.
a fresh clot, and a visible vessel as the four main stigmata of rebleed. Anything else to add?
So as we know, the forest classification, sir,
Forest
that
classification.
so
is there
the
anything else to add in the forest classification for the benefit of
the
the
forest 3 is ulcer with a clean base.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
That's what-
Okay, go on, Pawan.
Ultrasound abdomen and pelvis was done, which showed linear hyperechoic foci in the peritoneal cavity, suspicious of pneumoperitoneum.
All right.
Yes, sir. Immediately, patient was taken to surgery, where we have performed exploratory laparotomy, omental patch repair of duodenal perforation with peritoneal toileting and primary closure on 8th November. The intraoperative findings were single perforation of size 2 into 2 centimeters present in the first part of the duodenum with biliary peritonitis was noted. Rest of the bowel and viscera were normal. During the procedure, upper midline laparotomy incision was given, biliary peritonitis was noted and thorough wash was given. Bowel walk was done till ileocecal junction and perforation was noted in the first part of the duodenum, which was confirmed through leak test. Perforation was closed with 30 PDS with omental patch and again thorough peritoneal wash was given. Number 24 ADK drain placed subhepatically and abdomen was closed in layers.
All right. I'll involve Ravi in a bit, but Pawan,
Sir.
what about your comments about the surgical decisions made at laparotomy? What are the choices and why do you think the consulting surgeon chose this particular choice? You've done a laparotomy for
Yes,
a
sir.
perforated viscous. You see a 2 by 2 centimeter
Centimeters. Yes, sir.
perforation in the duodenum.
Yes, sir.
What are the options that you have and what are the concerns that you have about what you do?
Sir, whether the perforation may be due to any bleeding ulcer or any
1 inch by 1 inch perforation, would you call it a small perforation or a big perforation?
big perforations.
Big perforation. So with a big perforation, what are your options? Would you do a primary closure like it was done, but are there any other options? If there are other options, why would one think of these options?
Sir,
Hari, let me involve you, senior.
Sir, large ulcer perforation, sir, can be unlikely malignant here, but
Muni, any comments?
No, sir.
No comments. I think you should have some comments, man. You're a post DNB. All right. Ravi will expand on it, but let me tell you the primary concerns for any surgeon when he sees a large perforation is that with the kind of size that you have, the closure that you make, the primary closure may not hold. And if it's a large perforation, if you put just an omental patch, then even that may not hold, particularly if the edges are friable. all right? But the one thing going for the surgeon here is that the laparotomy was done early enough. If it had been done 48 hours later, then the concerns would have been even more serious. So once you have a fear that you will not, your patch may not heal, you have other options, okay? Now, Hari, do you want to take it up from here and say, what are the other options for closing or dealing with a large perforation?
Sir,
Muni,
one is
okay, go on,
Graham's
Hari. Yeah,
Graham's patch, sir. Patch repair.
just
of
told you
photo.
that a patch may be a difficult thing, okay, in a large ulcer.
Dissection and but
All
not
right,
sure.
no. Muni, you have a go? No comments. Okay, there are two other options, and I'm sure Ravi will dilate on. I'm sure this would have gone through his mind, but he would have taken a decision knowingly. The two options are that you do a formal duodenal fistula, where you put a tube through the duodenum, get a purse string around it, get a omental patch around it, because when you do that, you are draining it formally. You're doing a formal duodenal fistula. The other possibility is to actually bypass it. Okay, do a he already had a gastrojejunostomy, and I'm sure Ravi will talk about it. Okay, and put a jejunal patch on it. All right, so that when you say you don't anastomose the jejunum to the hole, but bring the serosa of the jejunum onto the surface of this large hole and stitch it around it, well away from the cut end of the hole, or at the edge of the hole, and stitch it to normal healthy duodenal serosa. So serosa to serosa patch will give you a slightly more advantageous patch or closure. So these are the things that go through every surgeon's mind when they're dealing with a large perforation. Over to Ravi for what he had, how and why he made this decision.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So I think all your points are well taken. I think they are absolutely the points that go through everyone's mind when they see this. See, the first thing to say is that this was not a conventional classical, punched out ulcer. So which made me think that it could be potentially a perforation, probably due to the endoscope, because it was more linear, the edges were ragged and they were irregular. So it usually, when you see a normal ulcer perforation, you see a clean punched out ulcer. It is usually circular. So this was basically a possible, we don't know how it happened, but it was a possible endoscopy induced perforation. There was as we thought initially, there was localized peritonitis, but the general peritoneal cavity was clean. So, and I saw that the duodenal area was, quite healthy. It was not friable. There was no, major concerns as far as the whether the patch would hold. So, as the sir said, these thoughts do go through your mind. And so what I did was to prepare the momentum, and then I took the first stitch, and then when I saw that the stitch held, quite well without any cutting through, then I thought, yes, I think we will be able to, and we got a good patch of the momentum. So we were able to put a good patch and put 4 sutures, and I think all the 4 sutures held nicely. So which we were able to, luckily, as you said, very, because this was when we went in early, so there was not much of peritoneal contamination in the first place, and 2, there was not enough time for the bowel to have become very inflamed and friable, and not being able to hold the stitches. So which is the reason why we were able to get, able to do a serosal patch. Otherwise, I would have certainly considered doing a tube duodenostomy, or better still, put a jejunal patch on this. As you said rightly, the thing is here, for the benefit of the postgraduates, you should not try to attempt to close the perforation primarily in these situations, where there is the friable duodenum, and you see it is very inflamed. If you try to do that, you are going to create a small hole into a very, very big hole, which will become unmanageable. So what you should do is to, initially when you look at the duodenum, you should cut your losses and say, I'm not going to try and close this. To then, take serosal patch well away from the ulcer, so that you, and then, because this patient already has a GJ, so we can't do a GJ. So what we have to do is to do a jejunal serosal patch, and then put and omentum maybe around it, so that all of these will contain the perforation and allow the perforation to heal. So
Sorry, yeah, that's perfect.
that
The
is what,
decision, yeah.
that is what we did.
The important point here is that the patient already had a diversion, already had a bypass in the form of a previous GJ. So that duodenum would not have been handling any food. It would be handling only pancreatic and biliary juices. And so to that extent, this suture line was protected. Santosh, your comments at this point about the cause for perforation.
Sir, if I'm not wrong, I think the endoscopy was done on Saturday, and the perforation and the signs of perforation were kind of detected on Monday afternoon. So I'm not very aware of exact differences between the iatrogenic and spontaneous perforation, laparotomy wise and even otherwise. But there was definite gap between the procedure and the a gap of about 40.
Pavan, can you come in and clarify that, please?
48 hours.
Yeah,
Where the patient,
Pavan, can you clarify that?
Yes, sir. Sir, endoscopy was done on 6th November, sir. Sir, on the patient complaining of pain abdomen, and will perform the surgery on 8th November.
So 2 days, 48 hours. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So Santosh's point also is well taken, that there has been a good.
Yeah.
One
Sir,
second.
yes.
I'll involve you.
Yeah.
There's a good gap between the actual performance of the endoscopy and the detection of perforation. For the postgraduates, can there be a delayed perforation because of endoscopy? Does it have to be immediately after endoscopy? I know that Pavan has a paper, putting a paper later, but Hari, can you come in and say what are the situations where you get an immediate perforation, and what are the perforations where and if a delayed perforation can occur?
Sir, post-surgery, like maybe
We're talking about post endoscopy, not surgery.
sir,
When would you expect an immediate, soon after the endoscopy is over, patient complaining of severe pain and difficulty, even including breathing difficulty? Why would that happen, and how would it happen?
it can be perforation one, and
I know that it could be a perforation, but why would it be? Why would the perforation occur after endoscopy? That is the learning of this M&M.
Perforation in the into the pleural cavity. I mean, like
not pleural, man. I'm talking about upper GI, in the stomach itself, or duodenum. Why would somebody perforate, or a colon, wherever in the abdomen?
Bleeding, sir. Collection of this.
We're talking about perforation, and you're talking about bleeding. See, you had this case, an absolutely great opportunity to look at all the mechanisms by which people get a perforation during endoscopy.
Yes, sir.
Very rare, but can happen. Okay, instead of just going on like this, let me just tell you the common things that I know of. You can over kinks and over bends, you can actually push your endoscope through, particularly when the patient is under anesthesia or is deeply sedated. Difficult to know how much you are pushing, and so you can push the endoscope through the bowel wall. All right, but much more common among all the perforations of during endoscopy nowadays, it is basically during polypectomies and other kinds of interventions.
Yeah.
Okay, that is when instead of taking only the mucosa, the endoscopist may go through the whole thickness. The third mechanism is when you're pushing through a very tight stricture, particularly during dilatations, not just pushing an endoscope through. Endoscopes are of low caliber, low diameter, but when you're dilating things, they can split. Instead of just getting dilated, they can split.
Yeah.
And the final mechanism is that when you have such a large insufflation, okay, happens actually during colonoscopy, for example, is a closed ileocecal valve. If you put a lot of air into the colon, you stretch it so much that it can split. Okay, so these are the immediate perforations. But there have been reports of delayed perforations of people who have had the same mechanism of excessive dilatation without a complete tear. What happens is that it is dilated to such an extent that the serosa and the muscularis have given way. The mucosa is just about holding. And 48 or even 72 hours later, there have been reports where that mucosa gives way, probably because it is ischemic. With the stretch of the dilatation, it can be ischemic, and that can give way, and you can get rarely delayed perforations after an endoscopy. Ravi, your comments first, and then Santosh to comment on what I have said so far, please.
Yeah, I agree with you totally, sir. What I have to say about this particular patient is that patient and the relatives told me that as soon as the procedure was done, he had pain in the abdomen, and that pain persisted, though he actually looked fairly well. Other thing is that what sort of caught my attention was that he was started on meropenem almost immediately after the endoscopic procedure. So I thought maybe Dr. Vijay Kumar might have had an inkling that he went into the efferent and efferent loops and they were fine. There was no evidence of any blood in any of these. So the stomach was clean. There was no blood residue. There was no evidence of any ulcer in the stomach. So he went into the efferent and efferent loops and they were also clean. So I thought because he found no evidence of bleeding there, he probably wanted to see the native duodenum and make sure that there is no bleeding there. So he tried to go in there, and that is probably when this problem might have happened. So that is my kind of
Sure. That's a thought. Yeah.
That's a thought. And immediately because patient complained of pain, he started him on meropenem and kept him nil by mouth. And the following day the patient was well, so our surgical team allowed him orally, but then the pain increased on the following day, and hence they investigated and then took him up for surgery.
Yeah.
So that is my thought process. I think
Right.
it was probably in his attempt to identify the source of the bleed, the perforation might have happened, because
Right.
that was already a very tight stricture which has previously been dilated twice.
Yeah. There are good points made in the chat box. Janani makes a very valid point. Was it acute ulcer that perforated? Possible. But nobody saw the ulcer during the endoscopy. That is the only thing against it. Nas makes the point that a stenosed duodenum, attempted negotiation, perhaps a little forceful, and so that might have caused it. Yes. And Ramakrishna makes a point that was it a sealed perforation which was opened by the insufflation of gas? That happens many times, but in this particular case, as no ulcer was seen, the case is similar to what I said about the acute ulcers that Janani raised. So it's unlikely that there was a pre-existing ulcer. Santosh, for your comments, please.
Two things, sir. As you can see in our endoscopy report, that the bulb was deformed, and when there's a deformed bulb, the views are pretty much obscured, and even no matter how much air we put, we try to find the whatever the least possible passage is available, and we negotiate. And after that, the erosive duodenitis was found out.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we couldn't find any perforation at the immediately after the procedure or during the procedure. That's one point I would like to make. And whether there was an acute ulcer, sir, I think you will be better. You'll be able to tell me better. whether the patient has had a GJ with a vagotomy, and after the vagotomy, can the ulcers be formed, or I'm very much ignorant about the.
Yeah,
Usually vagotomy, post vagotomy, if it is incomplete, here we have done a total truncal vagotomy, you can get ulcerations after, for example, selective or highly selective, vagotomies. But the ulcers are usually found in the jejunum rather than, they are unusual sites of ulceration rather than in the native thing. That is my thought. What do you say, sir?
Yeah, I agree. Even with the complete vagotomy, at the end of, after 5 years, between 5 and 10 years, I remember reading that the recurrent ulcer rate is in the region of 5 to 8%.
Yeah.
Even after a complete vagotomy, and it can occur either in the duodenum, or as Ravi said, elsewhere in the jejunum, or it could be a stomal ulcer. Okay, these are the 3 areas where you can get an ulcer. Okay, go ahead, Pawan, let's proceed.
There are various suture techniques for perforation closure. Among one is primary closure by interrupted sutures. Second one is primary closure by interrupted sutures covered with pedicled omentoplasty. And third one is Salam-Jones repair, where perforation is plugged with pedicled omentoplasty. And last one, the plugging the perforation with free omental plug, which is popularly known as Graham's patch.
Yeah.
On first post-operative day, patient was on ventilator with inotropic support of noradrenaline at a rate of 2 ml per hour with good urine output around 50 to 55 ml per hour, with abdominal drain around 200 ml, serosanguous with elevated TLC. Yes. And patient was still kept on ventilator on second post-operative day. Inotropes were stopped. TPN was started at a rate of 40 ml per hour, and abdominal drain was decreased to 30 ml.
All right. Before we go further, I would like to, for the sake of discussion, say 1 or 2 things. I missed it out in the earlier discussion. If you have an endoscopic perforation at the time of doing the endoscopy, or you have a situation where, as Dr. Ramakrishna has pointed out, you have gone in with a sealed perforation and you have blown it open with your insufflation. Okay, Pawan, I put it to you that the patient will go into shock much more early or much more quickly than a perforation that happens spontaneously. Why would that happen? This is an extremely important point. I've had practical experience in the UK when it happened, and it's important for you to know. Hari.
Sir, site of perforation, sir, like, or spontaneous will heal, try to heal it, sir, but I don't think maybe.
I'm talking about endoscopy. I'm giving you a hint. Endoscopy with air insufflation. The patient will quickly go into shock if there is perforation. Muni.
Simple, man. Muni Shekhar.
Muni Shekhar. Please note that in a spontaneous perforation without endoscopy, there is very little gas in the stomach.
We
or
are
the colon.
insufflating the gas also.
Here you're insufflating. So what happens is that there is a very tense distension. It is like a laparoscopy with a pressure of 20 or 25.
It becomes more and more.
Okay, remember that you are actually doing the endoscopy. Perforation occurs when the view is not good, as Santosh pointed out. And so you're putting more and more air. And if you're perforated, there will be a tense distension of the stomach, which actually compresses the vena cava, and there is no venous return. So the patient quickly goes into shock.
Sure.
What is the treatment? Remember this. You will never forget it once you have, understood the pathology, pathophysiology. What is the treatment? Quickly.
Nemo.
Hurry. If there's a
Decompress.
tense new, how do you do it, man? That is a practical point.
Needle insert.
Sorry?
Superficial.
Needle into the abdomen.
Needle.
Correct. Very good. Put 4 Gelcos. Okay. Stop insufflating and put 4 Gelcos. Not one. It won't be fast enough. Put those big needles into the stomach. The gas will come out with a whoosh. The abdomen becomes a little flat, and the patient will get the venous return and get the pressure back. All right. This is a very important point. So remember, immediate perforations at endoscopy, you must deflate the abdomen with needles. My next question pertaining to this slide. When would you start a TPN in a patient like this, and why would you start a TPN? Pawan.
Sir, in this patient, we done duodenal, that is omental patch repair done, no, sir.
Okay.
So patient having some ileus. So
Okay.
usually after 3 days, or if still GI functioning is there and patient having some nutrition wise, we have to support, means we will start TPN.
You see, you're very vague in the way you have answered. Was the patient malnourished before surgery? Is the first question the surgeon asks himself.
Okay, sir.
So you as a surgeon must ask that. Was this patient malnourished?
The patient is not malnourished, sir, but
Okay,
he,
you think so. Yeah,
Yes.
okay. So if the patient is not malnourished, how many days can you afford to keep him fasted?
sir, 3 days.
3 days. It's actually 5. Okay, so
Okay,
you
sir.
can do that. But what other reasons would you think the surgeon had to start a TPN?
And
Anticipation of prolonged ileus,
yes,
very likely to have sepsis. You have duodenal perforation. It is a little difficult to understand that the patient would be well fed. Remember, the patient was nil oral for at least 5 days by this point, right? So the critical point of 5 days was reached. Now, if the patient couldn't afford a TPN, couldn't afford this, what other option would the surgeon have? This patient obviously could afford, and so it was started on it. If you find a patient who cannot afford, it costs something like 3,500 rupees a day for a TPN minimum. So if they can't afford, what do you do? What option do you have? Sorry, go on, talk about it. Why are you quiet?
Sir,
PGs haven't spoken today. You have to speak. It doesn't matter if there's a mistake. Yeah.
sir,
Sorry?
nasojejunal.
You have read Naz's chat box. Okay, nasojejunal. What else do you have?
Sir, feeding at the time of surgery, sir,
Feeding jejunostomy. Okay, at the time of surgery, if you find a potential, okay, a potential for a difficult post-op period, you have a choice of putting a feeding jejunostomy. Okay, I use it very, very freely. And obviously in this case, the surgeon was confident that it would heal. And obviously the patient would probably be, I presume, was the affording type. So feeding jejunostomy was not done, and they started doing a TPN. Okay,
Yes,
go on. So you must understand that there are alternatives to TPN. Ravi, you want to say something?
You can't believe how affording this patient was.
Okay.
Because Prem Chandra Sagar was paying the bill. So
okay, that settles the issue.
no, the reason, sir, there are too many reasons. One is the thing is that I didn't pass the right tube down the efferent loop. If I had done that, I would have probably started him feeding. But I think it. I have to confess that it escaped my mind that I should do that, because there was already this perforation here. So I think because this patient had an MI recently and all these things, so this one was to get out of the table as quickly as possible. So in that hurry, I think I missed otherwise I probably passed the tube down the efferent loop, then we could have started feeding him down that thing.
Absolutely, yeah.
The other thing is that, as you said, already 5 days had passed, so we had to, and he was still on the ventilator. And because of that, we couldn't get the radiologist to pass the tube or anything. So we started TPN on him. And the other point I wanted to make was, because we hadn't found the cause for the bleeding and hemoglobin had actually dropped to 5.6, I did a thorough bowel walk all the way up to the ileocecal valve and didn't find any evidence of bleed there also. And and felt all along the colon to find for any malignancy or anything. We didn't find anything. So we for the time being, we thought it might have bled and it has stopped now. So we stopped, and we didn't do anything further after that.
All right, very nice. Go on, Pawan.
Yes, sir. On third post-operative day, patient was extubated and TPN was continued till POD4 at a rate of 40 ml per hour. Patient was shifted to ward on later day of POD4 and allowed clear liquids. Drain was removed on post-operative day 5 and patient was tolerating liquid diet. On POD6, patient tolerated soft diet and hence discharged on POD7.
Go on. Talk about. But before you go into this,
Yes, sir.
can I invite comments from Naz, please, Dr. Naz? Anything you have to add, ma'am, to what has been said?
Naz, unmute
Sir.
yourself.
Yeah. So I think all the points have been covered. I just wanted a clarification here, sir. If you have a choice of passing a nasojejunostomy tube, or would you like to do a feeding jejunostomy? Which one would be preferred, sir, in such a situation?
My choice is always feeding jejunostomy. Cheaper, nothing in the nose, and
Yes,
it's easier to manage. Nasojejunal tubes are of small caliber. They're much more expensive than a Ryle's tube. And while I would not operate to do a feeding jejunostomy, I would not even do a laparoscopy, forget about laparotomy. But
Yes.
at laparotomy, when I already opened the abdomen, I have no hesitation in saying my first choice is feeding jejunostomy. Ravi?
Yes, sir. I agree with you. I
Ramakrishna?
think-
Yes, sir, I agree, sir.
Okay.
We
Right.
use.
Naz, what do you think? Naz,
Yeah.
what is your view?
No, on table, if I have opened the abdomen, I would go for a feeding jejunostomy.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I
On
would have
table.
gone for a nasojejunostomy if it was in
Right.
subsequent.
Yep.
Yes.
All right.
And then
Ramakrishna,
sir,
sorry,
sir.
go on.
Yes, sir. And you just mentioned some needles, sir. I just didn't get that clear.
Oh, it's-
decompress the
it's-
abdomen.
It's a gel core Venflon, not an
Okay,
actual.
I
it's-
got it.
yeah,
It.
it's just IV, number
Yeah, IV
16
got
IV
IV
cannula.
cannula.
I got it.
I think it's
Yes.
a UK disease, Gelcor.
Yes.
Gel
Yeah,
core
yeah, that's
Venflon.
why I got confused.
I'm still there. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Okay, sir.
Ramakrishna, your comments, please.
No, sir, all points are well made out.
Okay.
Only thing, TPN, how far we could have delayed a little more because he recovered very quickly.
Yeah.
Without TPN also, he would have recovered, I feel,
Yeah. Sure.
probably.
Yeah.
That
It
is
is
Okay.
a little bit question number.
This is
Otherwise,
always a,
everything is
it's
fine.
always a dilemma. When
Yeah.
the patients recover well, you think, should you have waited? But if they don't recover, you always wonder,
Should we have started? Quite right. Go on, Pavan.
So the role of total parenteral nutrition. Total parenteral nutrition is a valuable agent in management of malnourishment and non-functional GI system. It is a mixture of various components containing lipid emulsions, dextrose, amino acids, vitamins, electrolytes, minerals, and trace elements. Inadequate gastrointestinal function, contraindication to enteral nutrition are the indications for total parenteral nutrition. Total parenteral nutrition usually administered to central venous catheter. According to Chaudhary and Reddy, TPN indications include chronic intestinal obstruction as in intestinal cancer, bowel pseudo obstruction with food intolerance, post-operative bowel anastomosis leak. The main adverse effects of TPN includes metabolic abnormalities like hyperglycemia and electrolyte abnormalities, infection risk like site of catheter and skin infection and sepsis, and venous SSR related with, that is pneumothorax and air embolism. As per monitoring of several variables is required while on TPN. They are toll hours, input output chart monitoring, urine sugar estimation every 8th hourly, and monitoring of various electrolytes like sodium, potassium, chloride, bicarbonate, and calcium, daily monitoring of serum electrolytes and blood urea, serum protein and LFT to be monitored twice daily. As per American Society for Parenteral and Enteral Nutrition guidelines, patient on TPN should be monitored daily until they are stable. If any metabolic abnormalities are detected or if patient having a risk of refeeding syndrome, then they require even more frequent monitoring.
All right, TPN is a topic by itself, but in the context of this presentation, I think you have said enough, but we must have a class, full class on TPN sometime. Okay, Abdul is not here. Please ask him to make a note. We should have a full class on TPN.
Okay.
Go on, Pawan.
Management of upper GI and upper GI bleeding can be divided into 3 phases, which are pre-endoscopic, endoscopic, and post-endoscopic management. The pre-endoscopic management involves hemodynamic assessment and resuscitation as needed. Blood transfusion is required at HB threshold of 70 to 80 gram per liter, and threshold can be higher if there is a severe bleeding with hypotension. Outpatient endoscopy and management should be considered if Glasgow Blecher score less than 1 or less than or equal to 1. Proton pump inhibitors and erythromycin can be considered. Cirrhosis patient should be receive vasoactive drugs and antibiotics.
Why antibiotics, Pawan?
Sir, in cirrhosis patient, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, in cirrhosis, there will be protein deficiency that leads to
Immunocompromised. All cirrhotics are immunocompromised.
Yes, sir.
Go on.
And endoscopic management is recommended within 24 hours after admission. In case of severe bleeding with hemodynamic instability, urgent endoscopy should be performed after resuscitation.
I will stop you here because
Yes.
our topic of discussion is not GI bleed.
Okay, sir.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Okay. This is more important. Please talk about it and we'll end the session.
Okay, sir. So, Devang Kang et al. Conducted a study on clinical outcome of iatrogenic upper GI endoscopic perforation using 10-year medical records of 1,49,792 patients, in which mechanisms of perforation were categorized as electrocoagulation induced or blunt trauma induced. The incidence and the clinical outcomes of iatrogenic perforation based on the types of procedure performed were evaluated. Iatrogenic perforations occurred in 28 patients out of 1,49,000 patients.
Very small incidence. Yeah.
Yes, sir. The image in the slide shows incidence of iatrogenic endoscopic perforations based on the type of procedure. The most cases of electrocoagulation induced iatrogenic perforations can be treated using endoscopic clips. If endoscopic closure fails for blunt trauma induced perforation, surgery is mandatory. Yes. And Richard Turner conducted a study in which he noticed duodenal perforation is a uncommon complication of endoscopic retrograde cholangiopancreatography, and it is a rare complication of upper GI endoscopy. He analyzed 5 cases of iatrogenic induced perforation where clinical features were analyzed and compared. Of this, next slide, sir. Of this, 1 patient recovered with conservative management and 1 patient died after initial laparotomy, and other 3 patients underwent various multiple procedures and long stay in the hospital. He concluded iatrogenic duodenal perforation is an uncommon complication of endoscopy, but when it occurs, it is a potentially life-threatening. Early recognition and early intervention may be better outcome. It leads to better outcome. Yes, sir. When Iatrogenic perforations is caused by various three mechanisms, like while during instrumentation, pressure over the walls of the bowel, and during deep dissection, when all the layers of the GI wall are involved, and unsuitable intensity or duration of current in the endoscopic procedure, transmural thermal injury may happen, which leads to perforations. So there are various other references, sir.
All right. Go on.
Although iatrogenic perforation could be a cause, the possibility of this is very less as per the studies. Peptic ulcer disease may also cause hollow viscous perforation. Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you. Well presented, Pawan. Can I now invite comments from Santosh? Do you want to go first and give your concluding remarks, please? Santosh, are you there? Can you unmute?
Yes, sir, I'm there.
Please.
Yeah, it's a learning experience, sir. No matter how many endoscopies we do, we still should be careful while doing the procedure, especially at the blind areas. And that's what I would like to tell, sir.
Yeah, Naz.
So it's a well presented, sir. And most of the points were well taken. Could we just cover up whether how would you manage esophageal perforations, whether it is minimal and whether
Time is up, Naz. We will do it sometime.
some other time? Yes.
We'll have, you know, it's a big topic, it's a very big topic. That's why I said
Yes.
we'll
Okay.
deal with it some other time. Ramakrishna?
Endoscopy, if the person has some crepitations in the neck, and how would you can just add a few points if you can, sir.
Yeah, I mean, if you suspect esophageal perforation, the first thing to do is to make sure that you cover the patient with broad spectrum antibiotic like meropenem or Tazac, piperacillin, tazobactam, and metronidazole. Keep the patient NPO and monitor him very carefully for possible perforation of the pleura, where they may have a pleural effusion in addition to a mediastinal contamination. Mediastinitis is a fatal condition. And so what you have to do is try and see if you can repair it quickly, if you can establish a diagnosis. That is done by the use of a water-soluble dye rather than barium, which should never be used when there is when the suspicion of a perforation. You would not wait definitely beyond 24 to 36 hours before you intervene. When you intervene, it is unlikely that you will be able to get a successful closure of the perforation because of the friability of the tissues there. So put drains, if necessary, both pleural cavities. You can consider an esophagostomy because 2 liters of saliva, 1.5 liters of saliva can go down the esophagus. So you may want to consider an esophagostomy. Definitely do a gastrostomy to vent the stomach and at the same time put a feeding jejunostomy and get the patient through the acute phase. Once that is done, there are endoscopic and operative options. As I said, it's a very big chapter. I only told you the first initial thing that you have to do, because you can use covered stents to cover the perforation, or you may have to do operative procedures to various kinds of patches on the esophageal perforation, depending on its location, to get a successful closure. Okay, so I will, as I said, we'll discuss it sometime. It is a very important topic and we will discuss it sometime. Ramakrishna, your comments, please.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah,
After doing so many endoscopies, we just take it for granted. And this is a caution that we must be careful with the endoscopy, especially if patient complains of pain after endoscopy. We should keep this in mind and investigate promptly and manage properly, intervene early. That is the take-home message.
Ravi, your concluding remarks.
I think basically, the major worry for me was this patient had a recent MI. So that was the major cause for concern at that time. And fortunately, early intervention, and he's responded to treatment well. and the management in the ICU was excellent. So hence we were able to have a good outcome as far as this patient was concerned. I think that is the major message.
Thank you. I think it was a difficult case, well managed, Pawan, well discussed as well. Thank you all the participants for very fruitful discussions. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Good night.